Hi.
So wonderful to see you.
Wonderful to see you too.
I think the last time I saw you was several years back when you had graciously invited me to join the judging panel for the Juilliard Concerto competition.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that was such an honor. And yeah, I was thinking about our meeting today, and I have to tell you, looking back, studying with you has been hands down one of the greatest blessing in my musical journey. And you just have taught me so much from technical craftsmanship of cello playing to musically exploring and really guiding my perspective and helping me transfer my imaginations and my storytelling from my heart or my head to the cello. Um, and yeah, it's been such a joy to journey and learn from you. And after so many years that has passed, I still draw from your impactful teaching on an almost daily basis. It's truly remarkable. And you absolutely do not need any introduction. However, I do want to briefly share that you have been with the one and only Juilliard String Quartet for 42 years. Is that right? 42 years?
Yes, I was.
My goodness. And served as the chair of the cello department at Juilliard. You have been a recording artist, soloist, recitalist, and advocate, and of course, commissioner of new music. And you are one of the most highly sought out teachers. And to those that had the privilege of being one of your pupil, you're our greatest cheerleader, you're our mentor, our role model, and kind of like a musical father figure to us all. And not to mention, your awesomeness in your painting, cooking for all of your students each year, and just the list goes on and on. And I want to let you know that you have literally like thousands of students all across the world, and we are all so grateful and so proud to have been your student. And we really admire and respect you as a musician and also as a human being. Yeah, and so this is such an honor to catch up and to chat with you today, which takes me to my very first question. Going back, who were some of your greatest musical influences in your life, and when did you decide to become a musician?
Well, so the obvious first influence was my family. My father was a pediatrician, but had wanted very much to be a violinist, studied some at the Institute of Musical Art when he was in high school and between college and medical school. Uh, he practiced every day when I was growing up. And I went to sleep listening to him practice the violin. I sometimes sat on our couch in the living room and watched him practicing the violin. Uh, Perhaps I didn't really understand what practicing meant, but I watched him doing it and um, and went to sleep with him doing it. And my mother was really a professional pianist with a degree from Juilliard and from Yale Music School because of how early a time it was, didn't lead a professional career, uh, which was difficult for a woman at that time. Uh, but she practiced every night. And when it wasn't my father practicing the violin, I heard my mother practicing Bach Italian Concerto, Chopin Preludes, and really practicing. And again, probably because I was 7.5, 8, 9 years old, I may not have understood what they were practicing or how it was, but I realized I listened to them practice all the time. Only a little bit later, my late brother Aaron Krosnick had the room across the hall from me in New Haven, and he was practicing scales and arpeggios and double stops and octaves and tenths and Spohr concerto, Wieniawski concerto, Vieux Temps concerto, Bach's solo sonatas and partitas. So again, I heard somebody practice. And with my brother, it was a little more obvious what he was practicing because he was practicing scale, arpeggios. He was practicing the things we learned to build our equipment. And I could hear him doing that. And as it went on, as I began the cello at age 8 or something, and I heard him doing this, he was 3.5, 4 years older than I was aware, probably jealously, that I was nowhere near as careful about my practice as he was. And I remember a time when I was about 14 where he and my father, but especially Aaron, said, you know, I bet you if I asked you to play 5 straight scales and 5 straight keys, you wouldn't know the fingerings, you know? And I got very upset that they said that. They were absolutely right. You know, I was talented and I was not serious about that and about the craft of playing my instrument. And as a result of that, I remember I did the only thing I could think of doing. I picked the key of E flat and E, I think, and played E major and E minor and E flat minor scales regularly. I didn't do all of them, which I certainly do at this point in my life. I play a different key every day and work through all kinds of things. But the influence, again, of somebody practicing right next door to me. If I were listening to him, probably I should have been practicing, I thought, and probably it was true. So in any case, those were 3 big influences. And when I was 8 years old, I began to play the cello. An enormous influence. My father and my mother were wonderful amateur chamber musicians. They played with friends, with students at the Yale School of Music, with faculty at the Yale School of Music, with other professional musicians. I began thinking of enormous number of professional musicians that I heard, members of the Kroll String Quartet, various people who always came and played chamber music with my father. And I listened to that and watched it. And among other people who came and played was a very young Aldo Parisot, who was studying at Yale just as an exchange student, not even studying the cello, and he was a brilliant and enthusiastic cellist and probably played with great pleasure. And probably when I was asked, what do you want to play? Well, I don't know what it's called, but could I play what Aldo plays? I want to play. I don't think I knew it was called the cello. But aside from the fact that from the very earliest time, Aldo took an interest in me and came and knocked on my practice room door and came in and gave me advice, I watched him practice also.
Wow.
I remember sitting on the stairs above a hallway to the living room, and he was practicing exercises, certain shifting exercises, shifting fast, a fifth, a fourth, a fourth, a fifth. I mean, all kinds, all kinds of things. And I watched him looking at the angle of his arm and his hand, and it was the same throughout the instrument, all the way through, not up and down, just the same, and the angle of the hand.
Amazing.
And I don't know that I understood quite what that represented at age 9, 10, but I watched it. And there was one other person of influence. The great violinist Joseph Fuchs was teaching at Yale. And he often stayed in my family's home.
Oh, wow.
And he said very early on, hey, do you mind if I practice? And look, if the kids feel like listening to me practice, I have no problem with that. So I remember sitting there watching him practice. And again, whether I understood exactly what he was doing, I knew he was working on the craft of playing
Mm.
athletically, physically, the violin, the sound, the hands. And I remember being very aware of that, saying, no, this guy's a real craftsman violinist.
Yes.
Not only he's an artist and he plays beautifully, but I watched. So those early influences were very important. And when I started with a very lovely man who was in the New Haven Symphony at 8, a man called William D'Amato. Then my brother's violin teacher, the concertmaster of the New Haven Symphony, a man called Howard Boatwright, was teaching at Yale as Paul Hindemith's assistant, actually.
Wow.
And he said, Joel should play for the new cellist here, Luigi Silva.
Mm.
And as you know, Sue, from the various editions of Paganini and Piatti and other things, Mr. Silva would have anything but have thought himself a natural cellist. He had very small hands. He'd been told by some very influential teachers, you have hands are too small, you can't play the cello.
Wow.
And he always took that very seriously. Well, he organized the hand, especially the use of thumb and the use of a one octave scale in thumb position, whether that was down here with the thumb on E on the D string, or on A, or on D, or where Boccherini wrote it.
Yes.
I mean, he had a real organization of where things were on the cello. And Mr. Parizot had a name for that, the geography of the cello.
Yes.
How important it was to know the geography of the cello. And years and years later, when I was in the Juilliard Quartet and professional cellist, I played at a cello symposium in Manchester, England, and Mr. Parizot was there. And he was always my dear friend. And he congratulated me for keeping my playing in such fine shape and all of that. And he said, that guy Silva, he told you where things are on this instrument. You know where everything is. And as different as their approaches may have been, Mr. Silva kept a book about what he told me, and he would look in the book again and he said, play me the one octave scales in starting on such and such. And if I hadn't practiced it, he'd say, come on, this was not for fun. Look, I want you to have this shape of your hand with the thumb and third finger a perfect fourth apart wherever you put it. And he would talk to me about strategies for playing the cello. And as you know, from his exercises, which he wrote for Piatti Etudes, for Paganini Caprices, he had an idea how to practice in order to get to be able to play something. And he left me with that feeling. And I remember once playing, and this was when I was already a teenager. And I studied with Mr. Silva from the time I was 9 till the time I was 20, 21.
Oh, long time.
And and I remember playing a transcription, a wonderful transcription, which I've been trying to get a copy to, of the Mendelssohn Spinning Song, a famous piano piece where a lovely tune in the right hand, beep bum ba bum ba bum ba 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 beep, and there's all over the cello.
Mm.
And I played that a lot, and actually early on, and I've recorded it, and I played it well because I played it when I was 12 or 13.
Mm.
And Mr. Silva was always very loyal. If I played a recital, he would make an effort to come. And I had played the Mendelssohn Spinning Song for Mr. Parizeau, who said to me, in the end, the passage was a typical Mendelssohn scherzo passage, like in the scherzo of the Mendelssohn Piano Trio, a three-note figure all the way to the top. And Parizeau says, Joe, you could play. And when you reach the second octave, do a ricochet and like, right? So I practiced that. And at that performance where Mr. Silva was, I did that. But the bow didn't bounce. So it came out, but a little boo. So at my next lesson, he didn't say anything about it at all. As I was on the way out the door, he looked at me and said, hey, by the way. I said, yes. Tricks are fine, but they have to work.
Oh, wow.
But the fact is that he was, as Mr. Parizeau later said, boy, that guy taught you to play the cello,
Mm.
especially where things were.
Mm-hmm.
He was a little less certain about the sound in the bow, and I did a lot of work on that later on. He even told me once, about the sound and about drawing and about supporting. I asked him some questions already when I was in college, when I was studying with him. He said, no, you have to figure that out yourself.
Mm.
But bowings, staccatos and this and that, oh no, he had lots of ideas on how to do that.
Wow.
So, and I think as you and I both teach,
Mm-hmm.
I use him and what he taught me every single day.
Wow.
Like quite literally.
That's funny you say that because I say the same thing about you. What you have taught me, I use it for my teaching literally every single time I teach. It's so important. And perhaps you could share a little bit about, were there certain routines that he asked you to do with certain exercises? Like, what would the typical lesson look like in Mr. Silva? Like, you would go in there and you'd be expected to do, like, what kind of materials during a lesson?
Well, I would play for him. He would sit back, and if I were set with something, he'd say, come, go, play. And he did all those exercises and wrote many transcriptions and things that involved all these techniques you see delineated in the preparatory exercises in the etudes. But one day, it was Elgar Concerto. By that point, probably I was 15 or 16. I'd studied with him for 6 years or something. I said, could I have your fingerings for the scherzo of the Elgar, the second movement of the Elgar Concerto? You studied with me for 6 years. You put the fingerings in. You put it, we've shared a lot of that about how you would organize it. You do it, and I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about it. So I came the next week, having been so influenced by all that we're talking about, the preparatory exercises and the ways of getting from here to there in terms of your abilities. And I'd fingered the whole second movement of the Elgar Concerto. And he said, play it for me. So I played it for him. And occasionally he leaned and looked over at the music, or fingerings that I might have, or something. And he started laughing. He said, those fingerings are so clever. He said, I never, I would dream of anything like that.
Wow.
Wow. And he said to me, ultimate compliment, I have another copy. It's a blank copy. I want that one. And he took my copy.
That's amazing.
You
Wow.
know, so there, I thought and indeed I think I was doing what I'd learned from him in terms of strategies, technical strategies to play. And he said to me, oh, that's a lot more brilliant than my stuff. You know, I said, are you kidding? Oh my God. Oh, all these substitutions and all kinds of things. But it's he who taught me,
Mm.
you know. Just the other day, I taught a young man who's probably 16 or 17.
Mhm.
And I've never been in a room with him because of the virus.
Mhm.
He'd learned the first movement of the Dvorak Concerto, but had never learned the last two movements. So I guess he learned the first movement for a competition or something. So he's doing the last movement. And we had a couple of pop etudes, that one. And he played them, and I was working with him on the shape of his hand and on not getting into just sort of squirreling around instead, really. And I had him practicing a little bit like you do in your exercises, the beginnings of each key, the beginnings of each triad. Look, it's that. And then you play other notes, but it's that, then it's that, then it's that. And I showed him. And he was working on last movement of the Dvorak. I said, play for me yom bum bum bidida dum bidida bim badadadi, the climax of the last movement of the Dvorak. And he got to and he's very gifted, this guy.
Mm.
And he played it without using the thumb, all with first finger, shifting up and down. And it was practically perfect. I mean, it was really. So I asked him to slow it down and showed him to be more accurate and released in the shifts. And then I said, hey, let me just show you another fingering.
Mm-hmm.
And I played with 2 and thumb, not 4 and 1.
Mm-hmm.
Thumb, 2, all using thumb. And he sort of went, huh? And I said, you know, I gotta tell you, we just played some popper etudes. All the popper stuff you just played involved thumb and 3 or thumb and 2. That it all involved using the hand this way. And I pointed out to him, if we play Boccherini, I mean, it's all that, you know, the actual Boccherini. And I think if Popper could have seen the fingering I just showed you, he would have said, oh yeah, If you could have seen your fingering, I said, incidentally, you're going to use your fingering. It's wonderful. You play beautifully. But Papa would have looked at you and said, did you hurt your thumb?
Yeah. Yes.
Did you? Is something the matter? You know? And I had him learn in front of me slowly that fingering.
Mm.
I said, I just want you to know what, and that fingering, all using this thumb and two
Mm.
in the shape. Every That's the fingering I learned in the Dvorak Concerto when I was 15 with Mr. Silva.
Uh-huh.
That's that way, and this is how Popper played the cello.
I could only imagine what kind of cellist he must have been. I mean, him and Piatti also, Concerto. I mean, these are cellists that just knew their thumb position so.
Even earlier than that, Anton Kraft
Mm.
was the cellist of the Schuppanzig Quartet,
Mhm.
which premiered all the Beethoven quartets.
Mhm.
He was in a trio with Schuppanzig. He premiered the Archduke in Opus 70 number 1 and 70 number 2. He was the first cellist in Haydn's Esterhazy Orchestra. If you look, and you can get it on IMSLP, the Anton Kraft Concerto in an old yellow paper edition,
Mhm.
look at the fingerings.
Mm. Mhm.
Boccherini would have looked at those fingerings and said, yeah, that's how you play the cello. He had that equipment of Popper, of Piatti, of,
Mm.
you know,
It's like using your thumb like an open string, and just.
that's exactly what I said to my student. I said, look, you think what I'm doing is strange. Look, you got an A string, a D string, a B string, a C sharp string, and a D string, and you got whatever you want. You got fifths anywhere you want to put it down. And that's what Mr. Silva represented. He studied with somebody who must have spoken to him about that. His name was Arturo Bonucci.
That was Mr. Silva's teacher.
Yes,
Okay.
Arturo Bonucci. And he was, I think, for some time, the husband of Pina Carmarelli. He was a famous Marlborough violinist for years. And they had a quintet together called Quintetto Boccherini.
Mm.
And he was the first cellist of that, and he played, you know. So he must have spoken that way. But again, we're dealing with influences on my thinking about the cello.
Mm.
And whereas Mr. Pariso would have talked about fleetness and moving up and down and all of that, in which Mr. Silva was interested when he saw me doing it.
Mm.
He would look right at me and said, what did Mr. Pariso tell you?
Mm.
I was sort of embarrassed, and he said, no, tell me. He said, well, he told me that it had to be, you know, one level, one position, and he said, I want you to listen to me, but I want you to listen to him too,
Mm.
But all of that you see that helped you learn the Piattis, that was in my training with him,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah, and you helped me tremendously during that time because you really helped me break down certain things. And not only that, I feel like it's the years of actually just kind of being in the same room with you, you talking about, concepts of how to place it down and the shape and all of these things are so incredibly important. Um, and I actually always wondered when I was studying with you that you were literally juggling million things all at once. You're going full speed nonstop and jumping from rehearsing, teaching, traveling, concertizing, with the quartet, and also doing solo recitals, often premiering new works, which really require some serious chops. Not to mention, that you would always make the time to go to all of your students' recital, and I'm so thankful for that. In any case, in your busiest season, how did you juggle your time, and how did you organize your space and your time and your mind so that you can prepare such difficult works even in the midst of your busy schedule?
Well, again, the organization of the technical organization is certainly very much involved in learning pieces. I
Mm,
mean, you're learning patterns, you're trying to find fingerings that will be as easy as possible. And I noticed, maybe mostly finally, when I digested a lot of what Mr. Silva said and was already beginning to be in the profession, I would notice that those strategies would play themselves out in my selecting fingerings, in my learning. Like I would play an atonal piece that jumped back and forth. Well, I could have told you, Sue, where my thumb was when I jumped back and forth.
mm,
Yes, I'm doing between an F sharp and a high G.
mhm, mm,
As I used to tell the students, hey,
yeah.
if you know where your thumb is, you can cut the leap in half.
Mhm,
And all of this was in my practice. And I guess I want to say one other thing, and that is that it was in my practice of scales
mm,
and of things to keep my equipment sharp, to keep working the intonation, that I think a lot of times I've met people who play scales and they play like up to the top and back, up to the top and back.
mhm,
What are you doing en route? It's not exactly in tune. What are you doing?
mm,
You know? And a lot of what I learned from Mr. Silva was in, and for that matter from Mr. Parizo, was in the accuracy of keeping my equipment articulate and ordered,
mm,
well ordered,
mhm,
so that if I practiced a half hour of scales and shifts and leaps and arpeggios, I was practicing, what can I say, 8 or 9 elements of craft.
mm,
Okay, now I'm ready to go. And that's not the students turn to me and say, "Oh, well, you warmed up." I said, "No, no, I didn't warm up. If I want to warm up, I can put my hands under the hot water faucet." You know, that's not warming up. That's placing the hands in the right way, as Mr. Parry said, in the geography of the cello.
mm,
What he said later on is, Mr. Silva showed you,
mm,
and in juggling these things, it meant that I could go over, yes, of course, I had to practice
mm,
and repeat certain things and then get so that I um, didn't regard the craft, but went with the musical lines and let the craft serve me. But I guess ultimately, here's the topic of our chat and everything. I learned how to practice,
mm, mm,
you know, and some of it, I mean, really took, when I was faced with the third Carter Quartet.
mm,
And the funny thing is, physically, it was a little more lavish than Piatti, in the sense that, in one simple sense, that it was multi-octave in the lines, so
mm,
that you would have to play lines that were not connected within one octave. They were. So you had to know where you were going, and you had to know how to teach yourself.
mm,
You say, how did I juggle all this? How did I practice this? That the fingerings I set and the things I figured out about the pieces were useful in the rehearsals.
Mm,
In other words, I didn't want to get to a rehearsal and realize, oh, for God's sake, I didn't.
mhm.
What I thought about didn't work. Yes, that works. I need to practice it more, but that works. Okay, I'll practice it more. I practiced always in ensemble music from a score. Just
Mm.
score to the side looking, oh, there's your part, and it's continued by the viola. And then the second, oh, okay. So I might play all three things and say, oh, okay. And I wouldn't just write things in the score. I would write my line, and his line,
Mm.
so again, the organization that I learned as a young cellist, I used.
Mm. Um, when you think about like those times that you would spend hours of practicing, um, thinking about, fingerings and whatnot, were you motivated on your own?
Um, I mean, that was very important because at first, of course, you grew up in a family who wants you to do your best. They
Mhm.
want you to do your best in the math course at school, in the English course. They want you to do your best. Oh, God help us. My mother used to go to my lessons with Mr. Silva, and she used to take notes at the lessons. But without saying anything bad about my mother, she was a pianist. When he would start to talk about bow things, and she didn't know what he was talking about. And so she would write stuff down and tell me later, Mr. Silva said this. I said, no, Mr. Silva didn't.
Well, this is not an advantage for Gwen. Gwen, Gwen cannot escape anything.
But in any case, um, it's very hard, somebody growing up and all my students at Juilliard. One of the things I do want to say is that in your original question about what were the influences, there's my family practicing, my mother, and my father, and my brother. My father had a tremendous record collection. I listened to live chamber music, I listened to all kinds of recordings and all of that. And I find that that background was very important, but also it breeds a little bit of a question about for whom are you playing? Whom are you trying to impress? What are you trying to achieve? And I must admit, I guess I thought after a while, when I won a few things, that I would become a famous cellist and a soloist, famous soloist. And I did, after all, watch Mr. Parizo very involved in that. And I thought that's what I wanted to emulate. And I pretty much played and practiced for all the wrong reasons. I
Mm.
mean, not my own reasons. And it took going to college away from New Haven to Columbia College in New York and running into composers and contemporary music, which was very uh, um, present at Columbia. I was a music and an English major,
Mm.
and courtesy of a very fine high school English teacher that had encouraged me to be a writer and a professor. But I was also a music major, and when I tried to get a recital, my music advisor was a composer, and he wanted to know why I wasn't planning on playing any music of anyone who wasn't already dead.
Mhm.
And he said, go talk to these composers who are now in our new doctoral music composition program, and convince somebody to write a piece for you.
Mm.
And I did that and wound up in a flute, cello, and piano trio with Charles Warren, the composer, and Harvey Solberger, flutist and composer, and started playing music that I'd never heard of, including very old pre-tonal music.
Mm.
But very importantly, music that nobody basically who'd ever spoken to me about being a good cellist and being famous and being had ever heard of.
Mm.
And I remember the feeling of a contemporary recital that I played at the end of 2 years at Columbia or something, where I played Shapey and Carter and Warren and thinking, this is terrible. It's also for all the wrong reasons. But thinking, well, my parents are in the audience. They wouldn't know whether I played well or badly. you know, uh, which was a very short thought and that means you need to be right here and pay attention. Really do it the very best you can for my own reasons.
Mm.
I loved the Shapey Sonata, and Ralph Shapey later became one of the presences in my life for 45, 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved Warren's cello and piano piece. The Carter Sonata in 1962 or something, or 61 maybe, was the first time I'd ever played it.
Wow.
And I played it with a pianist who helped me learn it, who became a very dear friend. And gee, I was playing this music because I loved it, whatever that meant.
Mm.
And for the first time, it was me doing this, and I think there are other ways, but it's very hard. And my parents were wonderful, but it's very hard. My teacher was wonderful. But when I thought later on of people I'd disappointed by not becoming the first president of the cello, I disappointed this teacher and that teacher and my mother and my father, and because there I was, 28, 29 years old, and I wasn't the most famous cellist that ever lived. You have to find your own reason for doing it, and I see it. I mean, when you had that Piatti project, okay, you wanted to make a recording of something, so you dreamed up that thing, but you're in the middle of it and you suddenly think, oh my God, well, this is a terribly demanding project, but a very exciting project.
Mm.
Wow, I want to get so I can do this because I'm going to be better.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you, when I first played Carter Figment, and I remember walking into that lesson going, oh, what is this stuff? I just remember like what, because it was my first time really being exposed to that kind of music. And I remember the voicing, dun, 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 and then like the way you lined the things up for me and, gave me kind of overview of how to look at the music and the language, the score reading, and just the, the voicings and how they lead and and all of a sudden the piece became so approachable and so enjoyable, and it's a piece that I felt like I could really understand. The organizational part that you were talking about, I think is tremendously important because as a student, unless you have that organized, I feel like it's very hard to motivate yourself, as you're saying, and it's very hard to enjoy it as you're practicing. And I'm so grateful for having been able to learn from you because I feel like you gave me that way of thinking. And if you would allow me to say, you have such depth to your thought. And I think as you think into it and then you share, it makes the other person think and dig deep too. And it's been such an amazing journey to teach, perhaps because I had such a wonderful teacher as you.
Look, I did my best, I mean, just, but I guess very important for you while you were teaching, and for me when I was teaching the people that I taught, is I'm trying to teach myself at the same
Mm,
time.
absolutely,
I
yes.
mean, when I was talking to you about how to figure out how the phrases worked, the jagged phrases and the lyrical phrases, and how they contrast and how they work in Carter, this is the piece that I learned myself.
Mm,
I mean, when I'm talking to somebody about, and I just gave 2 sets of lessons on Carter Figment in the last month. This is the piece that I would be practicing if I were practicing it now.
mm,
If I say, look, take this music and connect it with all the similar things,
mhm.
connect, and they say, oh, well, how do you think I learned those? And so it's always helped me. I describe whether it's a technical solution or a musical one or a combination, um, that it be something that I'm working on,
Mm.
that I have thought about, that I have, when somebody said, hey, where did you come up with that? I said, I came up with that to teach myself,
Mm.
you know. And when I look back at Mr. Silva, he wasn't a natural cellist. He
Mm.
had little hands. He had to teach himself, how do I do this? You know? And therefore, when a 9-year-old kid said, hey, how do you do this? He said, oh, I'll
Mm.
show you. And if you had, with your 3 kids and everything, late at night, 20 minutes or something, and you had something come up, you would know how to practice. Or, look, I'm getting out of shape. I haven't had a chance to practice. Okay, let me ground my hands. Let me make sure that the arm weight is in the bow and I'm drawing. So when you mentioned jumping around all over the place, I was practicing carefully in the times that I had. And some of the people that I studied with, Luigi Silva, Jens Nygaard,
Mm.
later on, very importantly, taught me how to line up. He had a lot to do with my sound and my learning to use my arm weight and my drawing of the bow. Uh, Again, how to practice it,
Mm.
you know, and a lot of it, I think I would turn to him and say, how do I practice this?
Mm.
And in terms of Jens Nygaard, he didn't play the cello. He was a prodigy clarinet player, but he was somebody in the Alexander sort of way who understood where to put one's energy and weight and how to.
I love Alexander technique. I think it's so beneficial. And
Yeah.
that really changed my posture and the way I play. Um, but yeah, sometimes I feel like students motivate me to practice also because you gotta do it alongside of championing it for them. And as you're journeying yourself, you're kind of allowing others, your students, to see it and walk with you.
I mean, now as I'm older, I can't play brilliantly and physically the way they do. I mean, some of the time I ask somebody to repeat something, so how are you doing that? You know, um, and I'll practice, but I know how to practice.
Mm.
I may have to illustrate for them slowly, but I can show them what, because I have practiced it.
Mm.
And And even to be able to say, I enjoyed saying to this young man who played me this passage in the Dvorak Concerto with a fingering I would never have used. If I'd have used that fingering for Mr. Silver, he would have laughed at me. He would have said, "Well, you got a problem." You know? So I taught him that fingering that I learned that Popper would have used, that Piatti would have used. And then I said to him, "By the way, you're not going to use that fingering. I just want you to know how it works and see that that fingering and the one using 1 and 4 instead of thumb and 3 is not exactly opposite. So you use this shape instead of this shape.
Wait, I can't see your hand.
You use 1/4 shape with the thumb in back instead of thumb 3.
Yes.
It's not exactly opposite. You're going to use this. You're going to use this, but consistent with the, you know, and then I wound up the lesson having him play his fingering for me better than he had played it. And I said, okay. And I said, I would spend a little time if you have it, learning the other fingering, just to see what it might teach you. And of course, that particular fellow will master that fingering, that one that I showed him, like that.
Oh, goodness. He's one of those, huh? There's always one like that.
It just makes me laugh.
I just so value your teaching, Mr. Krosnick. I just think your way of approaching the cello and the way you break it down for us is just so clean and clear, and I'm just so thankful that I studied with you.
When I saw your exercises and your examples, you have put it together in a very clear, unified way. I mean, I was tremendously impressed listening to you illustrate your exercises and thinking, yeah, okay.
You're not surprised from that. You taught me that.
No. Yeah, but you went in your way. And when I see that, I thought, yeah, okay. Okay. The one I must say, the one passage in Saint-Saëns,
Yeah.
which, you know, the famous passage at the end of the exposition, the double stops.
Yes.
All of those. Tim Eddy had a performance of it some years ago, 5, 6 years ago. He called me on the phone and said, "Joel, is that the very worst written passage in the history of the cello?" And I said, yeah. I said, but it's terribly unfortunate. It's very beautiful too. Yeah, I know. You know, and that when I was teaching it the other day, especially with arthritic problems, I can't do this with the third finger very well any longer. So I was trying to find ways, and also I have fat Jewish fingers, so I can't do it. To get an E and a B and an E, I can't do that.
But you know what? When you're going dun 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 dun, you with the first finger you pull the string over and then you do this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
And then you just
yes,
kind of,
sure. That's how. Yes. But you have focused it and unified it. Boy, that's your way. I've never heard anybody so clear and so brilliantly coherent, understandable things. I mean, you really do it. You know, somewhere when you and I weren't in such close contact, I learned the Donald Francis Tobii Concerto. Toby was a great musicologist, a friend of Casals, and a composer. in a Brahmsian Elgar way, a very good composer. Because he was very close with Casals, he wrote, among other things, a 60-minute cello concerto.
Mm.
And Jens Nygaard was crazy about Tovey growing up, about the analysis writings and everything. And he always spoke of our doing the Tobii Concerto. So I did it with Jens in the last year of Jens's life with the Jupiter Symphony in New York. We gave 3 performances of this 60-minute cello concerto.
Wow.
In a 60-minute cello concerto that was written in a sort of Brahms style. What Toby said is, I think it's terrible that Casals doesn't have a Brahms concerto. So I want to write him one, you know? And it's a very beautiful concerto. You can listen to recordings. It's really very beautiful. I have some discs of it also.
You have your recording?
Yeah.
Oh, I would love
It's
to.
not recorded, but I have 3 discs of the 3 performances that we gave. And I worked on it like crazy. I mean, 60 minutes, and I was playing quartet concerts all the time, and probably a recital or 2 with Gil. But I practiced like crazy on the Tobii Concerto because it was full of all the things that would be in a Brahms concerto: ornamentations in octaves, in tenths, in sixths, in thirds, and all of that. And as I was winding up the week before the performance, 15-year-old Gwen came into my studio and said, "Can I ask you something?" Yeah. When all of this is over with the Toby, are you going to miss it? And I said, terribly, terribly. I'm going to be, not to have it still.
What a question to ask.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question.
Wow.
I said, and she was on the way out the door, and I said, I guess you're hooked, huh?
It's-
What kind of question is that? Are you going to miss it? And I said, yes, of course I'm going to miss it.
That's
I'll find something else, but I'm going to miss it.
oh, I love that story. Oh
And
yeah.
I even heard there was a pianist that I rehearsed it with. And, I rehearsed it with it from the time when I was learning it.
Mm.
And I'm sure I wasn't very good at it, but I wasn't worried about it. I just had to continue to learn it. And that guy, that pianist, Chris Oldfather, a wonderful pianist of contemporary music, he went to the concert of one of the performances. And he said to somebody, I rehearsed that with Joel. I thought he was never going to be able to play it. He said, God, I thought, oh my God. He said, and I come here tonight and it's like, no problem.
Wow.
Geez, when we rehearsed it, I thought, is he going to be able to play this? Yeah, well, that's how it is when you're learning something.
Yes. Oh wow.
You know.
That's very encouraging.